All right. So for those who don't already know who you are, could you tell us who you are and what it is that you do?
Yeah. So my name is Tanner Guzy, and I am an image and identity coach. And essentially, I teach men how to be able to both form and express who they are, mostly through their clothing, but also through other nonverbal signals like grooming and body language and all this other stuff too. And I've been doing it now we're coming up on 5 years, being this my full-time one and only gig.
So how is it that you got involved in that?
I've always been, the best way I could put it is I've always been hypersensitive to clothing and its impact on identity. That it really kind of first started for me back in junior high school. I went to a private Christian school that had the stereotypical uniform of the gray slacks and the navy blazer with the rep stripe tie. And at that age, sixth, seventh, eighth grade, I was really getting into extreme sports, BMX, snowboarding, and then also very heavily involved in punk rock. And so that was a tribe that had a very disparate identity. I wanted green Liberty spikes and battle jackets with band patches on them and everything else. And I remember feeling this kind of dissonance about the way that I was forced to dress versus the way that I felt, and just kind of going back and forth. And it really, the way that other people would treat me, the way that I would perceive myself. And so very early on, I got keyed into how closely related our own self-perception is to the way that we dress ourselves. And fast forward quite a few years later, and I was doing broadcast journalism. That's what I got my degree in. I wanted to do political talk radio and wasn't finding anything really at the time, it wasn't able to build anything. So I decided to start a little style blog called Masculinity as a way to get better at communicating what I wanted to, get better at writing, keep my voice sharp, but not deal with the heaviness of talking about politics all the time. So it was a hobby. And pretty quickly it started to gain an audience because I talked about style in a way that was very different from a lot of the other bloggers at the time who were very suiting focused. This was 2011, 2010. And so this was when Mad Men was really big. And so a lot of it was focused on suits, or a lot of it was just very trend driven. Here are the 3 sneakers that you need to wear to be on trend this summer. And I like to take things differently. I like to think about the meaning behind things or what it implies or how it all ties together. And so my approach from very early on has been kind of the philosophical connotations of appearance and also how that directly ties to manhood and masculinity.
That's a very interesting trajectory, because it seems like you moved through a couple of subcultures pretty quick and ended up in something like, excuse me, something like classic style. So could you talk a little bit about the process there? So you're, in kind of have like the prep school uniform, then you're like in this punk rock cultures, BMX culture. I assume there's kind of like different ways of dressing in all of those little subcultures. But here you are now talking, I would say probably mostly about classic style.
Yeah. And I would say a big part of it has to do with that evolution, just as you mature. When I was 23, I was working in a credit union and I was still dressing like a skate punk. And my boss came to me one day and basically said, look, this is hurting your job, where the people that are coming in to ask you for loans, they see you as a kid and it's hurting your credibility here. I realized it was hurting my dating credibility. And I realized that these things that I had really built my identity around, about the concerts that I would go to or the bike that I would ride, were things that I still enjoyed, but they were not the core of my identity at all. And so I started to dress in a way that changed that. And that process has been something that I continue to experience as my identity grows, or as I self-develop into a bigger and better version of who I was, then my style evolves to reflect that. I'm in the middle of a big change with that right now, where my style has been relatively safe for the last few years. And part of that is because I live in the suburbs. I'm a dad of 5. And a lot of it is trying to signal to my clients or my potential clients that when they want to come work with me, that I'm not going to turn them into some fashionista, or it's not going to be totally out there. Like a lot of guys assume that it's kind of queer eye for the straight guy. And it's going to be really avant-garde and crazy. And that's not what I do. But at the same time, I found that I'm not feeling congruent with who I am on the inside and how I'm expressing myself on the outside. So I'm going through another phase right now of starting to explore what the newer, better version looks like. It's a constant evolution for me.
So be a little bit more particular. In what sense was your style safe?
Yeah. So my uniform for the last few years was pretty consistent. It was a pair of jeans. It was a Henley. And then it would be different pairs of shoes depending on what I was doing. In the fall and winter, it would be different jackets depending on what I was doing. And it worked because it fit well. The colors were somber. It was better materials. And so when I'm in a sea of guys that work in the tech industry and they're wearing Lululemon sweatpants and then whatever free t-shirt they got from the startup they happen to be employed at for the last 3 months before they jump ship to go to somebody else, I looked significantly better. But at the same time, it just was safe and it wasn't expressive, and it was hitting on more of my kind of rugged physical component of who I was, but it wasn't hitting the rakishness and the rebellion and wanting to be a little bit countercultural again. And so it felt like I was leaving boxes unchecked that at this phase of my life, I would like to start checking again.
So in what ways in particular do you see your style changing to make it less safe?
No idea. This is what's fun is I'm in a total experimental phase. I'm doing things like combining kind of classic menswear stuff. I've really fallen in love, and I've embraced this for years, but I love high-waisted stuff. I love the proportions that it creates. I love how it looks when you're in good shape and you tuck in a shirt and you combine that with high-waisted stuff. I've always been a big fan of texture. And so like today I've got on a pair of flannel trousers that are part of a suit that I own, but I'm wearing them with a vintage pair of Nikes because, I'm not doing anything that needs me to be particularly dressed up. And so it's this kind of like high-low casual formal combination. It's classic lines and aesthetics, but injecting modern meaning into it. And a lot of it is just raw experimentation. And there have been phases in my life where I've done this and I know I can look back and cringe where it's like, what was I thinking doing that? And I'm sure in 5 years I will look back and cringe on this now, but I have to be willing to make some of those mistakes in order to land where I am. And this is unique for me. This is not something that I make, that I have my clients do or that I have other people do, because I care about this more than most guys do, and arguably more than most men should. And a lot of it is being able to explore so that I then have kind of what the normal guys' parameters are, so I can help my clients play within what those parameters are, because I know the whole spectrum and all the extremes.
See, I'm going through something a little bit of the opposite. So I work as a professor at both a university and a junior college. And I'm probably coming from the end where I've been almost too formal.
Gotcha.
Sport coats, dress shirts, ties, trousers, dress shoes. And now I'm starting to work kind of a little bit backwards and trying to find unique and interesting ways to introduce more casual pieces so I can kind of dress up, but still dress down and not be overly dressed.
Yep.
So I really connect with that.
No, I love that you're experimenting with that. And that's a hard thing to do because a lot of guys they associate style with formality, and their only way of experimenting with trying to dress better is to dress more formally. And then as soon as they start moving more casual, they just throw it all out the window. And there's so many good ways to be able to be incredibly casual. You can have great style in the gym or at the beach, or when you're running to pick up groceries on a Saturday morning, or when you have to take your kid to the hospital or whatever. Like, you can have great style and have it be thoughtless and effortless because it just is the only stuff that you own on any realm of that formality spectrum.
Yeah. And I would say that that's something that's probably, at least dressing more intentionally, even when you're going about doing activities that aren't normally associated with being formal, is becoming less and less common, if you will. So I think with, the pandemic, the lockdowns, the work from home uniform, people are not as likely now to actually intentionally dress well for those occasions, if that makes sense.
It does. I'm going to push back against that a little bit and say that I think that we're just seeing a deepening divide, because you have a large majority of people, and I think you could make the same argument with fitness, where the average person is no longer just trim and fit and healthy anymore. You have this kind of move towards people being overweight and people not being able to be strong or not having good cardio health or anything. But then you have a smaller, very intentional subset that really takes their fitness seriously. And this is what I've seen over the last 2 years, because man, when COVID hit, I thought my business was done. It was a luxury business, and it was largely directed at guys who were working in environments where it was expected. And I found the exact opposite. My business has done nothing but grow, because those that are intentionally focused on self-development and just go about other things in their life intentionally find that their appearance is one of the boxes that they need to check too. And so yeah, we're definitely seeing guys move away from it, but you're also seeing a really good percentage of guys really embracing it as well.
I see. So it seems like, if I understand you correctly, in general, it's not getting better, but for those who are interested in it, they're getting more intentional about their dressing.
100%. Yeah, that's a great summation. Yeah.
I see. So I was reading your article. I can't remember where it was published, but you were talking about bringing back a kind of, and I don't know if this is the word exactly that you used, but a kind of provincialism in style. So in this particular article, you were talking about the dressing environment that you kind of like live in, and trying to reacquaint people with dressing a particular way in a particular place. I can't remember the exact language that you use, but do you know the article that I'm referring to?
Yeah, you're talking about the opinion piece that I wrote for the Deseret News, which is one of the local newspapers here in Utah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm trying to grasp is, you think that we will be able to, or what you're trying to argue or encourage people to do, is that to find unique kind of subcultures of dress in the places that they live. And so could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think I think that there are quite a few upsides to globalization. There are a lot of things that are really positives of it. I think at the same time, there are a lot of costs that come with globalization as well. And one of those things is we get this complete homogenization of culture, where I can eat the same foods here that I do anywhere else, or downtown Salt Lake has the same type of architecture as you would get in Denver or in New York or in Beijing or anywhere else, other than the kind of like one-off random buildings. It's all just glass skyscrapers, and it's all the same. And we're experiencing the same thing when it comes to clothing. Is everything has become largely homogenous, and people start to feel like they're just part of this great big blob of humanity. And again, there are upsides to that, of not having the tribalism and the us versus them, or the, we're different than you. But at the same time, there are costs associated with that as well. And it is sad to see how much true diversity we lose with this homogenization of culture. And I think that one of the things that people should continue to do is embrace things that are local and unique. And part of that includes their clothing. And you should really find ways to lean into that, so that the style in Utah is different than it is in Colorado, which is different than it is in Mexico, which is different than it is in Japan. And it should be different that way.
Okay, this is what fascinates me. How do you think that is possible?
I think what it really comes down to is some measure of intentionality. I don't think that happens on accident anymore, where you have to get people to really kind of embrace a local culture or embrace a subculture. And, I think a lot of this even comes from my experience being involved with punk rock, because that was an incredibly intentional counterculture, and the aesthetics were all driven off of being offensive. And when you look at other very intentional countercultures, whether that's the Amish, or you get like very Orthodox Hasidic Jews, or you get social justice warriors, or anything where their entire aesthetic ethos is, we do not want to look like we fit into the mainstream. We want to look like outsiders. And I don't think that every state or every city or every subculture you find on the internet or anything else needs to go to that extreme. They're at 100%, but you should have a good 30, 40% of, I don't want to look like the rest of you. I want to maintain what's unique about me and where I am. And I think everywhere or every little subculture should embrace that. And what that looks like is going to be very different. The way that's developed is going to be largely organic, where, the way that I was talking about it in the articles, and where I am in Utah, we've got Mormon pioneer heritage, and you've got Native American heritage, and you've got this kind of like tech culture boom that's happening. And you've got this massive outdoors culture with skiing and climbing and all of these other things. And there are really cool, unique combinations that we could create by taking elements of all four of those. But instead, here we just try to dress like we wish we were in California, because then maybe those companies will validate us instead. And it's a waste. It's a waste of our potential, and it's a waste of our identity.
I guess I would call into question to what extent. I agree with you. Like, I would like to see more diversity in the way that people dress. Absolutely. I'm 100% on board with it. I think where I start to call that into question is that I was having this conversation with a man named Heinrich Wilberg, and he was talking about how it is that he learned how to dress. And part of his learning how to dress experience was actually visiting through Europe at a time when globalization was not as pervasive as it is now. And so he would go into, like, for example, these little towns in Italy where they had very distinctive ways of dressing. But the reason why they were able to kind of develop this little subculture of dressing is that they could only actually get the items that were in their immediate vicinity, because there wasn't something like creativity. Sorry, go ahead.
Scarcity creates creativity.
Could you explain?
They're limited in what their access is, as far as not only the physical resources, but the design options or anything else. And so what it does is it just expands and expands on itself until it really spins out into its own very small subculture. And when you have access to all these other things, that doesn't happen. It's the same thing with any sort of scarcity. If you tell me that I can use any medium to create art, then I'm not going to create something nearly as effective as if you tell me if I have to paint or I have to sculpt or I have to use colored pencil. That limitation is what actually stems that creativity. And so it would make sense that you would go to these small Italian towns where they are very limited in what they have access to, the materials that they can use, the design elements that they can pull from, the language that they speak, the religion that they believe in, all of these things, that it's so small and so focused. And that's what's going to create this very unique aesthetic for them.
Yes, but it's also that they only have access, which is a situation that we don't have now, because if you have access to the internet, you could almost get anything from anywhere. Like, for example, right now I'm wearing a Neapolitan sport coat that has soft spalacamica shoulders, right? So at one point in time, you could only actually get a jacket like this in Italy.
And not even just in Italy, in parts of Italy, like in Florence versus being in Milan, because it was that specific. Yeah,
precisely. And so I guess what I'm trying to understand is, given that we now have the internet and given that globalization is as pervasive as it is, how is it that we are going to work to develop these unique subcultures of style?
I think part of it is that as we continue to see more and more cultural balkanization on the internet, where you see actual rejection of completely different ideologies. And so you get into these same kind of limited spaces, and it's not limited by virtue of what you have access to so much as it's limited by virtue of what you want to give yourself access to. And as you continue to stay in those, really, I guess, for lack of a better term, those bubbles. I mean, you see this all the time with lingo. Lingo is a really good example of this, where you go on to different subreddits or you go into different Telegram chats or different channels, and the idioms that they use or the acronyms that they use, they don't make any sense to anybody that isn't already super steeped in that culture. And so it becomes a way to not only separate the us from the them, but also to even more deeply integrate the us with the us. And to me, it makes sense that you will see a natural expression of that as things move out from just being on the internet to being in real life as well. And so we will see aesthetic versions of that jargon or of those signals, and we'll see it in clothing just as much as we see it in chat rooms or on Telegram. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that actually does make sense. Okay, so what I want to do now is transition to talking a bit about masculinity, because one of the things that's distinctive about you and your content is that you heavily, you heavily emphasize masculinity. And to me, the reason why this is so fascinating is because it's a stark contrast to a lot of people's stereotypes about appearance and dressing well, because generally that's categorized as being feminine. Mm-hmm. And a lot of men, when they start dressing well, they'll usually encounter this problem. I know that I did. People would start out, well, are you gay? Like, why are you all of a sudden concerned about the way that you dress? Are you okay? And so what I want to talk about is, in what sense you think that masculinity is associated with dressing well or caring about your appearance. Can we talk about that?
Absolutely. So the first thing that I would say is that we are very, very much steeped in a culture that holds this idea, essentially, that real men don't care how they look, or that if you were a red-blooded masculine man, the only appropriate relationship to have with your appearance is indifference. It's, I don't care, and I don't think that hard about it. But we have to zoom out further culturally and historically and recognize that that is a very Western 20th century view on aesthetics. And if you go back in time to any other point in history, you look at any other culture in the world, and men have always used their clothing as a way to signal their masculinity. It's a way to signal things like status or courage or strength or honor or what your vocation is or anything else. And ironically, I always laugh at this one because the men who were the most concerned with their appearance, it was always the warrior class. It was always the men who were traditionally considered to be the most masculine. They were the ones that had very specific clothing. And they not only had what they wore on the battlefield, but they had their ritual clothing and their ceremonial stuff and all of these other things. And we still see this in the military today. You have a dress uniform, which is very different than what your PT gear is and everything in between. And if you dare dress like somebody in the military without having served in the military, that stolen valor is a massive affront to them. And it's a complete lie and affront. And so we still have it. We just limit ourselves in what our perspective on it is. But no, masculinity has always been correlated very strongly to concern for aesthetics.
Yeah, you said if we go back culturally and historically, I would even go further and say if we even went back biologically, because being concerned about appearance and using dress as a way to signal masculinity, or if we're speaking more broadly, maybe even virility. Mm-hmm. If you look at other animal species, they use their appearance in order to do that.
Totally. And they do it to signal two primary traits, danger and sex. And I mean, that's arguably, if you wanted to boil masculinity down to its most basic fundamental things, it's I want to have sex with everything and I'm going to kill anything that's trying to kill me. It's danger and sex. And whether it's peacocks, male peacocks have brighter feathers, or male lions have the big manes, or anything else, the men or the male of the species is almost always more plumed or decorated than the female because of those two virtues or those two attributes.
Yeah. Why do you think it is in modern times, so to speak, that we've drifted away from that notion or that view of aesthetics?
This is totally speculation on my part, but the way that I've been able to kind of think this through in my own brain is, first of all, you have to look at industrialization and especially the cultural revolution of the baby boomers in the 60s. Where it was a complete rejection of almost anything that was considered to be traditional, where this is what dad did, this is what grandpa did, never trust anybody over 30, culture is created by the youth, traditionalism is oppressive and all of these things. And so you had this rejection of these ideas of, no, you should wear a suit to work, or you should wear a hat, or you should care about what your appearance is in a way that signals things like dignity or self-mastery or status within a refined culture, any of that. So you get that kind of rejection. But at the same time, they didn't take it far enough to where we are now that you have a complete rejection of the very simple dichotomy of men are men and women are women. And so the way that they would make that work within their vernacular and within what their moral framework was, real men, true men, don't care about how they look because they reject all of these stupid, antiquated systems that limited us, that oppressed us. And then you get it reinforced in culture with things like Clint Eastwood or John Wayne or all of these other kind of like lone wolf characters, where it became very obvious that true heroes and good men do the right thing regardless of what anybody thinks of them. And there needs to be that moral framework that my morals should not be determined by other people's opinions of me. I should do what I think is the right thing purely because it's the right thing. But then we extrapolate that into, I shouldn't care what anybody thinks about me in any regard. And I should only do what I want to do, not what I think is right to do, but I want to do because that's what a real man does, or because that's what this lone wolf kind of lone ranger type of man does. And that's what a lot of these men aspired to be.
It seems like there's a somewhat odd but interesting association also with like egotism and the rise of egotism. Like I don't care what other people think. I'm going to dress however it is that I want to dress. And we all know that, dressing has been described more than once as, a form of manners. So there might be kind of like an interesting relationship between those two things as well that I didn't even think about until this moment right now.
No, I think that makes perfect sense, because when you think about the three biggest institutions that are bigger than the self, you have the church, the state, and the family. And we've moved away from all of those, where there's not the same, there's the same subservience to the state, but there's not the same loyalty to the state. We're not patriotic like our grandparents were. We don't identify as Americans or as whatever other nationality we are to the same extent that our parents did. You've certainly seen a decline in the church And we've absolutely seen a decline in the family, and we've replaced all of those institutions with the self. And so I think you're right. It only stands to reason that egotism means that, no, I'm going to set the rules for how I want to dress. And it's your responsibility to not judge me for that, because otherwise you are what, invading you're invading my sovereignty by forcing me to submit myself to something that's higher than just the self.
That's fascinating. There's a lot to chew on there.
That works. Yeah, but we'll see.
Yeah. It seems like concomitantly at the same time with this rising egotism since kind of the boomer generation, there's also been the rise in kind of like feminism. To what extent do you think the rise in feminism has affected this concern about aesthetics? Because it seems somewhat ironic. You would almost assume that, given people stereotypes that caring about your appearance and dressing well is stereotypically feminine, that with the rise of feminism, more men would be more concerned about how they dress and how they appear. But yet that's not the case. Do you think that there's a connection between the rise of feminine and a loss of this masculine aesthetic?
Man, this is a good question. I don't know if I've ever thought about this, which is insane, because so much of what I talk about and do is related to masculinity and feminism and everything. But I don't know if I've ever thought about a correlation between the rise in feminism and men's relationship with aesthetics. That's a good, okay. Let's think through this one in real time. Do you see any correlations in there? Like what do you see the connections as?
I don't know that I see a correlation. I'm just stating that I find it ironic.
Yeah.
I suppose.
Yeah, because this idea, maybe it's related to the idea that was part of the rejection of traditionalism and what gave birth to that egotism, where real men let women vote, or I'm not threatened by a strong woman, or some of these other things, where it was almost this kind of rejection of what the traditional mores of the patriarchy were. And you had to kind of flip it on its head and say that that's what real masculinity was. So I don't know, maybe there's something there.
There might be, this might be a stretch, but let me posit something. We'll see if it pans out. But there might also be something associated with the rise of feminism and women entering the workforce. So as women continually enter the workforce, the necessity of having a man as a breadwinner has become less and less.
Okay.
So there's this idea of the strong, independent woman who doesn't need a man.
Don't need
no man. Yeah. So what I'm suggesting here is that because it's become less and less the case that women are dependent on men financially, right, and because they're taking up more room in the workforce, men have less incentive to be concerned about their appearance and the way that they dress, because they might be less likely to attract or impress a woman who is a strong, independent woman who don't need no man.
Okay, that rings really true. I think that makes a lot of sense. I also think that makes a lot of sense outside of the workforce, but then you get the opposite effect of it within the workforce, where as soon as you introduce women into what was traditionally a male only, or at least a male dominated space, then things start to change, where the status competition and the status signaling starts to change as well. And so when it's a bunch of men that are competing with each other for status, then clothing becomes a part of that, because clothing has very traditionally followed these gender lines. But then as you move away into this almost kind of gender neutral, maybe even a little bit androgynous, and you think about like the tech uniform of jeans and a t-shirt, women can wear jeans and a t-shirt, men can wear jeans and a t-shirt. And so when you don't have the hyper focus on this is how men aesthetically compete or signal status or placement within a hierarchy within each other, because we've now introduced an element of chaos into that by bringing women in and they have different aesthetic values, then I think that starts to bring the lowest common denominator down as well into something that's going to be. And so I can see it going both ways. Yes, you're not as likely to compete for attraction because you no longer have the status or that primary breadwinner role, everything that you were talking about as far as attracting women. But then even with that intrasexual competition, that's no longer in its bubble either. You've now introduced intersexual competition in the workplace too.
That's fascinating too, because it seems like if you look at like the way that, I don't know a lot about women's clothing, but if you look at the way that women dressed when they were entering the workforce in, the 60s, 70s, 80s, a lot of them were wearing, women's forms of men's clothing.
Right.
Like I've just become really fascinated with like the 80s and 90s and menswear. And I've, associated with that is seeing pictures of the way that women dress. And, for example, they would have jackets with a lot of structure in them.
Right.
So that they had an
these
almost
Glen
masculine
plaids
appearance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So they kind of have this masculine, they're trying to project themselves as being masculine. And so they have broad shoulders down tapered to their waist. Yep. So they look like men because they're trying to project a very powerful look. Totally. But you can see that that's kind of like diminished over time. I mean, you still see it now and again for women who are involved in like kind of like the high corporate world. Right. But in general, it's not as popular.
Yeah. And I wonder if even that correlates with feminism and just kind of the more primarily feminine directive to include and protect as opposed to test and stratify, which is how more men are. And so we culturally have moved away from these hard definitive markers, and it's more about being inclusive anyway. And so when you have certain looks that may be more powerful, or they only work on particular builds, or these things that are inherently limited, that is a threat to that feminine directive, and women are more comfortable with things being inclusive. And so it would move to clothing being more kind of nebulous that way too.
Maybe that's partially what's changed as well. It's where it's like the early forms of feminism, they were basically trying to be men. Mm-hmm. That's functionally what they were doing. And I guess there still is some of that, but maybe that's not so much the case now. Maybe there's kind of more an embrace of the femininity in feminism, so that you have, the overriding or overarching values, as you're suggesting here, of inclusivity and comfort.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. This is really interesting.
I'm glad. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about something related to this as well. So I think this question will be a little bit easier and maybe we'll have more to say.
But the hard ones are fun.
Yeah. So I've had a couple of conversations with men and women who are involved in menswear, and we've talked about men wearing dresses, and they kind of put the argument to me, and I'm not sure how to properly ever to respond to it, but they basically are making the argument in a kind of postmodern way that there's nothing inherently masculine or feminine about particular articles of clothing. So if you look at a sport coat, for example, there's nothing necessarily, in their opinion, anything inherently masculine about that can be worn by anyone. Or to take, the popular example now of, men wearing dresses. They say, well, there isn't an issue with a man wearing a dress because a dress is not inherently feminine. It's just that we socially or culturally have assigned that particular article of clothing the label of being feminine or female. And so I'm curious what it is that you think about this and the kind of like what position you would take on it.
I guess what I would ask is, why is it a problem that these only have inherent or only have value because that's what we've assigned? That doesn't mean that there isn't value. My money only has value because it's been assigned value. That cotton on those bills or those numbers on my phone don't mean anything other than what we have made them mean. And so this idea, and we see this a lot, where if something is a social construct, ergo, it has no real value. And I think that's a stupid argument to make, because yes, you can take the idea that the only difference between a man in a skirt and a man in a kilt is the culture in which he finds himself and what is injected as far as the meaning and the symbolism of what those two different garments are. That's totally true. And that doesn't mean that we have free reign or that it's morally good or inherently desirable to give a middle finger to all of these traditions and the idea of masculinity and femininity. And we just go into this postmodern androgynous world in which anybody can wear anything. And so I would definitely challenge that idea that just because it's not biologically driven doesn't mean it doesn't have real value.
So I guess maybe I'm not posing the question correctly, or maybe I'm not articulating it well, but I guess that might be the position that they would take. So they're saying, well, then what is the issue? What issue would you have with a man wearing a dress?
I don't want to live in a world where men pretend to be women. There's moral value to that.
I'm just playing devil's advocate.
Totally. Yeah. And I'm saying it emphatically because that matters more to me. The symbolism of a man wearing a dress has infinitely more value to me than whether that clothing inherently is masculine or feminine. It's everything that gets tied up into it that matters so much more. Does that make sense? Am I clarifying that the right way?
Yeah, but I just want to make sure that we split those two because I think that they're both interesting. So on the one hand, we have the idea that some articles of clothing could be considered as being either objectively or subjectively feminine or masculine. So that's one prong. And then on the other, you're saying, well, regardless of whatever, if these are just merely constructs, it's irrelevant. What I'm concerned with is that we are using feminine constructs on males, as is exemplified in the form of a man wearing a dress.
Yeah.
Do I understand you correctly?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is one of the things that I teach my clients, and I think tell me if this kind of makes sure that we're on the same page too, is you have the general idea of aesthetics. And these are things that are kind of largely almost even follow science, like the golden ratio or color theory. And even when you look at kind of biological masculinity versus femininity, men's clothing makes you look bigger and it has more of that V taper and it signals these kind of inherent things like strength and courage and stuff like that. Whereas feminine clothing tends to be softer and it also will accentuate things that are more kind of like what their curves are, or it signals youthfulness or fertility or some of these other things.
But see, right there, that's what I'm saying. Here, I think you're dealing with this side of the prong when you make a claim like that, because this is the position that I've been taking with them. It's that these articles of clothing are constructed in such a way to be appealing or flattering to the sex of the person who is wearing them, which is to say that they are constructed in a way to objectively accentuate the masculine or feminine form. So I would say, for example, a sport coat, at least as one that's, that has good structure or a lot of structure, is objectively a masculine piece of clothing.
I would agree with that because of its structure.
Precisely.
Totally.
So it's not merely, if I understand you correctly, then it's not merely the case that, for example, a dress, which is constructed in such a way to accentuate the female form and make her more attractive or flattering to the opposite sex. It is not merely that it is just a construct. That piece of clothing was objectively constructed in such a way to make her appealing to men. Totally.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And so the only thing that I would say in addition to that is that that's maybe 15% of the puzzle, because you can start to twist and manipulate things like that. But I do believe that there's objective differences in that for sure. But the other 85% is the meaning that we attach to these different articles of clothing. And that's again where you can, because you're right. You look at kilts, and kilts were not made out of lace. They were not frilly. They were not dainty. They were not designed in a way to accentuate the curves or the accessibility the way that a skirt is. Yes, they were cut largely the same way, but the material that was used or the drape that it had, or even the way that it would move with the men who were wearing it versus the way that like a pencil skirt is going to move or drape on the body of a woman who's wearing it, they're entirely different. And so, yeah, you can get down to the basic level of a kilt and a dress are the same thing. And it's like, no, they're not, because just because they may have the same shape or attach around your waist the same way totally omits all of these other variables like texture and cut and drape and weight and everything else that does lean more towards it being inherently masculine or inherently feminine.
I honestly never thought about that until this moment right now.
Is that really true? Does that sound right?
Yeah, that sounds absolutely correct. I mean, I never thought to, I mean, because I was actually going to bring that up because that's the most obvious example that
Right.
everyone uses, a dress is just like a kilt. Well, a man could wear a kilt, And it's like, well, I never even stopped to consider that, they typically are not made of the same fabrics. They don't have the same drape. They don't have the same designs. There's a lot of different features there that I didn't even really ever take into consideration.
Yep.
Okay, so we dealt a little bit with this side of the prong. I want to try to deal a little bit more with this side of the prong. So, why is it that you are concerned with the symbolic subversion, so to speak, of the masculine?
Because I believe on both a biological and even deeper on a moral, philosophical, and for me, a religious level, that men and women are different. And that is a good thing. And that the world is better when men act more like men and women act more like women, because we're not supposed to be competing with each other. We're supposed to be complementary to each other. And as we move more and more towards androgyny in everything, in the roles that we're expected to hold, in the way that we're supposed to parent, all the way down, even into the way that we dress, society becomes worse and worse. People become less and less happy, and things get worse and worse off. And so I want to fight it on as many fronts as possible. And that includes fighting it on an aesthetic front.
Okay. So it's just clothes, though.
But it's not. There's so much meaning in clothing. That's like saying writing isn't writing. It's
words.
No, it's not even words. It's just random dots of ink on a page. And it's like, no, there's so much more that's infused into that. We take these random symbols that I do this and it looks like an E. And then I put that together with a few other letters and it creates a word. But then I put those words in with other words and it creates a sentence. But it's not just the sentence. It creates a feeling. It creates a call to action. It creates a history. It creates a culture. It creates a people. And so clothing is not just clothing any more than language is just sounds, or literacy is just scratches on a paper.
So why do you think that this is occurring in our culture? I want to spend a bit of time talking about this because this really fascinates me. So you would agree that there is an attempt, and we might say broadly by the left. I think that that's probably accurate.
Sure. Or just postmodernists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To subvert masculinity, and one form of the way that masculinity is being subverted is through clothing, although I would likely assert that it's not the only way.
Oh, not even close. Not even close. Yeah.
So I want to talk about some of those other ways. But before we do, I want to kind of get a sense of why it is you think that this is occurring in the first place.
That's a hard one too, because it really depends on, do you believe in this like New World Order, Illuminati cabal that they know exactly what they're doing and they're pulling all the strings? And what it does is when you get men to be weak and estrogenic and addicted to their bread and circuses, except for us, it's, DoorDash and Pornhub, then they're less likely to rebel. And so they're just going to be complacent and compliant. And then the overlords are able to have power. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's that these are just the fruits of feminism. And as we have embraced feminism and moved towards a culture that worships at the altar of inclusivity, that anything that rejects inclusivity or tries to put it at anything but the pinnacle of morality becomes a threat. And so it needs to be subverted and needs to be done away with that way. I mean, there's 1,000,001 different reasons that you can come up with. And there's probably some element of truth in all of them. But I don't know. I don't know the real answer to all of it.
I was just going to ask, what is your answer though?
Well, mine is, okay. So this is where my religious component comes in. A lot of you guys have probably already assumed this because I've talked about being in Utah, but I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I believe in God. I also believe that the devil is real. And I believe that he's Lord over this earth, and there are things that he is pretty happy to have working in his favor. And so I see a lot of that, those kind of diabolical plans in that. And I want to apologize for that, because that's what I see as the roots of all of this.
Okay. So what are some of the other ways that you see masculinity being subverted?
Ironically, one of the biggest ones that I'm seeing is the complete what's the word I want? The complete rejection of the power of fraternity, where men are being completely isolated from how much we need other men, especially because everything about our relationship with other men has been sexualized. It's the same thing with, oh, you care about how you're dressed, you must be gay. Or it's, oh, you care about other men and you love other men and you have a deep desire to have a real bond of brotherhood and real friendship with other men. And you don't think that your wife is supposed to be your best friend and she's supposed to fill every single one of your relationship needs. And you yearn for love from other men. It must be because you want to have sex with other dudes. And so we take all of these very deep needs that we have for people in our lives, the need that men have for children, the need that children have for fathers, the need that men have for brotherhood. And we sexualize it. And then we convince ourselves that the only reason that I want it is because I want to have sex with men. Or now you're starting to even see it with children and pedophilia and how disgusting all that is. And I think that that's one of the biggest ways is we've been robbed of brotherhood because we've been convinced that any desire for it must mean that we're gay.
What are some other ways?
I see it in the stupid bifurcation that we saw in the 20th century, that you could either choose to be the smart, nerdy weakling, or you could be the dumb jock, but you had to pick one of those, one or the other. Whereas again, traditional masculinity, the way that the aristocratic class in the 16th through the 18th centuries, the way that the ancient Greeks were, the way that the Romans were expected to be, really the way that men have always been is, no, you are morally obligated to become as competent with your brain and your body as you possibly can be, as opposed to choosing one or the other. And now we're kind of living in this revenge of the nerds type world where you get all of these guys that were picked on in high school because they weren't physically or traditionally masculine enough in that one-dimensional way that was very much focused on, because that was what was needed to win World War I and World War II. And so there was a hyper focus on that. And you get the rejection that comes against that. And we live in a world that's run by nerds, that they don't want anything to do with traditional masculinity because that means they may not be the top dogs anymore.
You say we live in a world run by nerds. Are you referring to the people who are involved in the tech industry?
Yeah, because government doesn't run the world. Social media runs the world. Google runs the world. Twitter does. They're the ones. I mean, if they're the ones who can control whether or not I hear what the president of the United States has to say, the president's not in charge. The tech dorks are in charge. And they're the ones that hate masculinity, because if we went back to a traditionally masculine world, they'd be back to having their heads stuffed in toilets.
Yeah. So I think I picked up on, I think I know how you're going to answer this, but do you see a part of the kind of rise in cancel culture and the limiting of free speech on online platforms as a way for these men who are not traditional men, who are not very masculine, as their way of getting revenge on the world for
100%.
Not
100%. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way to finally get that bully back and show him who's boss. It's finally a way to just get back in dad's face, who just rejected me because I didn't make the football team or anything else. It's completely just emotionally driven revenge porn.
Yeah. And it seems too driven by somewhat feminine instinct, right?
Mm-hmm.
Once again, you have that idea that you want to try to be as inclusive and comforting as possible.
Right.
And the reality is that those values, when they are treated as the arch value or arch values, they are not, what's the correct word? I want to say they can't coincide with a culture of free speech.
Right. And that's the problem, is those are values. Inclusivity is a value. Tolerance is a value. Benevolence and mercy are values, but they're terrible overvalues. They only work when they're in the proper hierarchy with other values.
Yeah. So it seems like that is part of the reason for this rise in cancel culture and
totally
limiting of free speech.
Yeah.
It seems to me like one of the things that's interesting to me about this is that I kind of like am one of those nerds in a weird way. So I'm probably traditionally masculine in a lot of ways, but I'm stereotypically feminine also in a lot of ways.
Okay.
So in the way that I dress, I would consider myself to be masculine.
Mm-hmm.
But then I'm like, I have a degree in English literature and I read and write poetry. And so those things are like stereotypically considered to be feminine.
But
see,
only now.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. It's only at this point in history that they are actually considered to be feminine, because once upon a time, it was primarily warriors who were actually poets.
Right.
They were the ones who were writing the majority of the poetry and literature. But now, for some reason that I don't necessarily understand, that's come to be considered kind of feminine.
And I think it's because we get one-dimensional. We get so focused on, if I'm a warrior, then I'm just going to focus on that. Or if I'm physically competent, I'm just going to focus on that. Or if I'm more intellectually driven, or I'm more cerebral, or I'm more philosophical, I'm just going to focus on that. And then it leaves these gaps in there where you need all of it to be able to understand it. I've gotten incredibly more articulate and intelligent as I've spent more time lifting weights and training combat sports. Like, it's amazing how much better my brain has developed as I've done those things, or how much better I do in the gym, or when I was boxing, or when I do these other things, because I'm not just an idiot, but because I seek to understand how and why it works, and then leverage that to actually make it work for me in a way that's more effective. They're not mutually exclusive. And we miss out by allowing these very stupid postmodern stereotypes of one being masculine or one being feminine, when it's really, again, just the way in which it's done that makes it more masculine or more feminine. You're going to tell me that Tolkien and his poetry was somehow effeminate? The dude fought in the war. The things that he wrote, the way that he was, and he's effeminate for that? That's garbage. What a stupid stereotype.
Yeah. See, I also train. It's interesting because it's one thing that I wanted to discuss with you as well, because I train Muay Thai.
Yeah.
And I spar. And so it's like, it's very difficult for me to, find people who are not one, as you described, like one dimensional.
Right.
Because,
that's the challenge.
I work and live in academia. And so that's like one very, very left oriented world where there is like, even the men who are involved in it very often are not in any way traditionally masculine. And there's a part of my nature that speaks to, that part that loves literature, poetry, etc. But then, I go to a Muay Thai gym and I train and I like to fight, but then I go there and it's like, I can't talk with anybody, anybody that, trains there about Shakespeare.
Yeah, exactly.
About clothing or about, poetry or something like that.
Nope.
They look at me like, what the fuck? Are you gay?
Right. Exactly.
So I don't know, like, how do you see us coming to a place where we can start to, in a healthy way, incorporate these so-called masculine and feminine behaviors or hobbies and interests so that we could have a more kind of like whole person? I
think this is the beauty of the internet and the beauty of online subcultures, because I have found in real life that it is hard to find people who are multidimensional. Until I started posting about it on the internet, I started using my name, and then people knew where I was located. And now I have a gang of friends that are not one-dimensional. And most of them are guys that I've met through the internet, or it's guys that I've met otherwise, but then they express an interest in, I want to learn how to do this and I want to learn how to do that. And so I think it's really just being able to lead out on it and doing what you're doing, but talking to your students or talking to people in academia about all the incredible benefits you get from Muay Thai, and doing it in a way that it's very sincere, and that showing them that you're integrated that way. Or with all the guys that train Muay Thai and helping them see how much of that warrior ethos there is in literature and in aesthetics and in these other things that they consider to be traditionally feminine. And the more that we do it on the internet, the more that we do it in real life, the more that we embrace the fact that we are going to be outliers. I don't have to convince everybody to be like this. I just have to find the other 10% of men who are like this, and then be content to be in a subculture with them. And then I'm set, I'm good. And then it it can spread and do even more from there.
Fascinating. I think I'm definitely going to have to start doing that.
Yeah.
So one of the last things that I kind of wanted to talk about before we head out is where you see the future of menswear going. Obviously, we know that the last 2 years have been, at least for the general public, for most people, have been in terms of dress downgrading over time, right? With the pandemic coming to an end, at least I hope coming to an end, with most of the lockdowns coming to an end, how do you see menswear developing out in the next 5 to 10 years? Do you think that there's going to be a resurgence of interest? We're going to get more men interested in menswear and they're going to be concerned about dressing up and their appearance? Or do you think it's going to be the case that they're going to continue to be more and more slovenly because it's easier to be so?
I think we'll see all of it. I think kind of like what we were talking about before, you'll see a good push of the kind of consumer comfort seeking bread and circuses type guy that just absolutely loves that he can go to work in sweatpants and a t-shirt. And he's going to do that when he goes back to the office, if he goes back to the office at all. At the same time, I think you're going to find other very disparate groups of men, whether that is like the right-wing bodybuilders and the stuff that's going on there, or even what your typical blue collar workers are doing. Like some brand is going to step up and replace Carhartt because of that kerfuffle that they had as far as the vaccine mandates and totally misreading their audience. And that's going to turn into something. And I think as much as we see homogenization within macro culture in different micro cultures and subcultures, I think we're going to start to see more and more separations and distinctions, but a lot of those may end up being what, for lack of a better term, like secret signals, where if you don't speak the language, you'll see somebody wearing something, oh, that's different, and you won't think anything more about it. But for guys who are in that same tribe, they'll look at it and go, he's one of us. Like he's one of my guys and he gets it. And so maybe that'll be with suiting. Maybe that'll be something as simple. You know, I just did a thing on this on Instagram yesterday about tucking in your shirt, where that is a nod to traditionalism. Gang. Yeah, tuck shirt gang. It's a nod to traditionalism, but it's also something that guys who are a little bit overweight can't pull off and make it look good. And so it's something that you have to be in great shape to be able to make it look good. And so you may start seeing guys at the gym or out on the street that are wearing a shirt that looks tucked in, and you go, oh, that's different, and not think anything more. But other guys who are tuck shirt gang or tucked gang will look at it and go, oh, maybe he's one of us. And so they'll kind of start to pick up on those things. And so I think that we will just see more and more of a push towards subtle tribal signals in clothing.
So you don't want to make a general statement about whether it's going to be dressing well is going to be more or less popular?
No, because I think we're kind of at peak homogeny. And as we move more and more into these different subcultures that are created further and further and developed further and further on the internet, we're going to start moving further and further away from it. I get asked all the time, like, what do you think the next big trend in menswear is going to be? And it's like, who are you asking? Because, you know, it's not like it was in the 70s or the 90s and we even start to see this. Okay, here's a really kind of a funny example. Do you remember The Wedding Singer, the Adam Sandler movie?
Absolutely. No.
So that was made in 97, and it was a throwback to 1985, and the world was different enough that it felt like it was this major thing. If we were to do that now, if you were to make something that was the equivalent of then, now it would be a movie that was based in 2010? What were mainstream cultural things that were as ubiquitous as the style and the music and all of these other stereotypes that you could come up with in the 1980s? What was something that was that ubiquitous in 2010? There isn't anything, because we already had subcultures. You already had people moving in these other directions. And then that balkanization has just been exacerbated by social media. And so when you say, well, what was the mainstream focus of the 2000s, it's harder to do that than it was with the 90s, or the 2010s is even harder to do that than it was, like the 1950s, let alone another time. And so I think that we're just going to move further and further into microcultures as opposed to any sort of a mainstream culture.
Yeah, that made me think too, because now it's like once upon a time, there was an opportunity for there to be kind of like stark contrast between decades, because not everything was as accessible as it is now,
right,
with globalization and the internet.
Yep. Again, okay. that scarcity, those limitations are what created the creativity.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so now we have to start artificially self-imposing those limitations. And for most of us, we do that ideologically. And then it moves into, like we said, jargon, acronyms, idioms. And then I think it'll start to move into aesthetics as well.
All right. Well, those are the questions that I had for you today. Thank you very much.
Good questions, man. You made me think. I love it.
So where can those who don't know who you are, where can they find you online?
So the main website is masculine-style.com. That's where you can go. You can find old articles. You can get on the mailing list, stuff like that. I don't do a lot on there. That's just kind of the homepage, the landing page. I'm very active on Twitter and on Instagram. And so both of those are at Tanner Guzy. And you'll find that I talk a lot about style, but I talk a lot about this other stuff that we've addressed. We'll talk masculinity, philosophy, family, feminism, religion, all of it, everything that's related to being the best version of yourself.
Do you also offer coaching?
I do. Yep. I do both group and one-on-one versions of the coaching. If you want to know more details about that, the best thing to do is either follow me on Instagram or on Twitter, and then shoot me a DM, and we can talk about what you're looking for and whether or not I'm going to be a good fit for you. I keep my DMs open on both those platforms. So yeah, if you're interested in working with me, send me something over there and we can talk.
All righty. And I'll make sure to put your links down in the description below so that they can access that.
Perfect.
All righty. Well, thanks again for coming on. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a blast, man.
All righty. Have a fantastic day.
You too.